Hi, this is K.N.Fitzwater and you're watching my channel. Today I'm going to answer one of your questions, which is about how do you deal with a character that has a false belief. This is not in a religious sense, but it's a ideal that is not healthy for the character. And how do I deal with that as I write this down? So that is a really great question, and I'm so happy I finally get around to answering this. So thank you, Nat Lopez. As you all know, I am a pantser, or as I would like to call a intuitive writer, where I discover the story as I write. And how I discover the story is based on the characters' actions and their decisions. And I had mentioned this in my previous video called Choosing Character Over Outline, where I discussed in a way how the characters' upbringing, their motivations, and their inner ideals lead their actions to where they want to go, or at least they try to go where they want to go in the story, and how they're going to react to the problems and obstacles I lay before them determines how they're going to go off and handle that situation. That's how I discover the story as I go. I choose the main character and I just throw a bunch of crap at them and they have to overcome it. How do I incorporate a character starting out with a falsehood and then they overcome this truth? I do it based where I am in the story arc. You may have heard of the 3-act structure, where you have the first act, which is the familiar world, and you have the second act, which is really the adventure of the story. It takes up half of the whole book. And then you have the last bit, which is the third act, which nowadays we call it the climax. In one of my previous videos, I talk about how I see it as a circle, kind of like a clock, where they progress in a circular manner, where the bottom half of the circle is the unfamiliar territory, and also where the second act is. And the top world is the territory that is familiar to them. Of course, when I say territory, I don't mean a physical country or land. It can be, but I'm talking about a situation that they're familiar with and they're not familiar with. In that story arc, we have a normal breaking into the second act, the midpoint of the story, or in Joseph Campbell's sense, the meeting the goddess, which is actually pretty important when dealing with the character overcoming a falsehood. So we'll go back to that soon. And then, of course, you have the last quarter, which is breaking into the third act. As I progress through this clock, as I write, I think about where the character is. Are they kind of in this stagnant, perfect world, or at least they think it's perfect, and they're describing a want or a need, and they've been introduced to a situation or a problem. At that area of that story, I try to showcase their false belief. Now, false belief does not necessarily mean religion or a spiritual ideal. It can be if it is unhealthy for the character, but it could be as simple as saying low self-esteem, or that, oh, I'm not going to amount to anything. In the case of Bilbo Baggins, he is not a burglar. I am not a burglar. I am a gentleman. I'm a in, bag in. And he really isn't typical. We can see that he's in a higher station than the rest. You can see that he is a little bit of a stick in the mud, very persnickety about how things are. If you watch the Peter Jackson Hobbit, the first one, you can see how he likes everything in its place, not to get dirty, not to get messy. This is the first time he's meeting these dwarves, so he hasn't really built the camaraderie with them yet. We don't have them voice their false belief. It is incorporated inside of them. It is an ideal that is not healthy. This Bilbo Baggins is very stagnant and set in his ways. And as Gandalf said, you weren't like this when you were a kid. And that's the only glimmer that we see to show that what he's doing is considered unhealthy for his character. So I think about what is considered unhealthy and how they could showcase this through their actions. And their actions is going to originate from their ideals and their beliefs. The false belief can be tied to the want and need. A character has a want, which is pretty much staying the same. And the need is that they need to be changed and transformed. And in order for that to happen, they need to find out the truth. That truth comes to the goddess. When Kronos was around, he had devoured all of his children and incorporated them inside of him. Now, deities don't really die. It's just a way of explaining that they're trapped inside of Kronos and they just can't, get away. Zeus happened to escape and able to leave that situation. In his journey, he had met one of his sisters that is not devoured. And she tells him what to do to free his siblings, which is creating this amazing soup that smells great, looks great, feels great, everything is all pleasant. But the moment anyone eats this soup, it's so awful they have to, expel. That's where most of the meeting the goddess originates. Joseph Campbell studied these stories, these Grecian stories, and saw the theme that's incorporated to these stories. And this is one of many where the hero meets that goddess who's going to give him a piece of information that he could go and change the world, change the situation that they're in. This is very similar to what I think of. I try to think of, as I'm putting the problems down, how they're going to learn a piece of information that's going to make them not wander around, but going to make them take action. That is at the midpoint of the story. That's why I like the circle analogy. It kind of looks like a mirror where half of it can be reflected to the previous situation. When Bilbo obtained the ring, that's when he became a true burglar. And was able to sneak around and do all sorts of stuff with this ring. Now, we all know that this is the ring of power, but in this story, it was just a neat little trinket that helped him do what he wanted to do, which is become the best burglar of all time. The journey in the second half of the story is them trying to find that truth and then trying to take it and change the world. Now, of course, in all stories, they aren't able to change the world until the last quarter of the story, which is the third act. So on the clock, they break into the second act, or, I say the second quarter, They're wandering around, bumbling around this foreign territory until they meet a guide or a bunch of friends that's going to help them set on straight. And then they find the truth of the situation, and then from there on they try to go and change it. But they haven't able to incorporate this truth inside of them. They won't be able to do that until the third climax. So from here on out, this section, this is where they have to transform, and part of them dies. Sometimes it is the death of the mentor. Sometimes it is the death of themselves. A piece of them goes away for them to accept what it is they need to have. So, for instance, we could say Captain America, the Winter Soldier. If you haven't watched this movie and don't want any spoilers, just hang on tight for a moment. I'll try not to spoil anything. In the first half of the story, he's trying to figure out why S.H.I.E.L.D. is turning renegade. Agent Fury is telling him not to trust anyone in S.H.I.E.L.D. Even though he's been working with S.H.I.E.L.D. Most of his recent career. At the very middle of the story, they finally found the place that tells them what's going on, which is a faction inside of S.H.I.E.L.D. that is like a parasite or like a virus that had infiltrated into the organization, and they're going to have it do horrible, horrible things. That truth helps Captain America stop being the wanderer and trying to search and survive from these rogue S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. And then he's able to go and fight against them for the most part. And he's got a plan. Well, he doesn't have a plan yet, but he's got, something he could work with and is able to progress from there. So for those who want to have a different analogy, think of it as the labyrinth. They enter the labyrinth, they found the item they want to take out of the maze, and now they have to get out of the maze. And breaking to the third act is them having the gem, and now they're going to take it to the familiar world so they could change it to the way they want it to be, because they have this truth. Now, the maze is trying to prevent them from getting to the item. They throw obstacles in their way so they won't get to it. Now they got the truth, the item, they now have to get out, and the maze is doing everything in its power to prevent them from leaving. This is where, here in this story, someone dies, and this is why this part is where the villain throws most of his strength. Because they're trying to prevent them from changing the world. Now, just because they attain this truth doesn't mean they believe it completely. It's hard to accept it at first, but as you think about it, you come to terms with it. And that is that section. The hero is coming to terms with what they know. Some of the heroes are able to do this more quickly and able to do what they can with it. Others, not so much. For instance, with Woody and Buzz, Woody has to accept that Andy is going to like other toys other than Woody. And Woody is not always going to be top dog. But so long him and Buzz are loved by Andy, it's going to be okay. But this is something that Woody does not accept entirely. Until near the very end of the movie, where he can't do things without Buzz. And he needed Buzz. And Andy needs them both. How I incorporate this as I write is that they're still running on their previous motivations and their previous ideals, their previous mindset. They can't quite believe it and they need more time. So they're still running on the past fumes that had carried them to this point. So that is probably the first bit right here. By the time the villain throws everything at them, they come to a choice, a personal choice of do I incorporate this truth or do I die from denial? And something has to give. It can be a mentor that passes away and they have to continue on without them. It can also be a part of themselves that had died as well. Does tie in with the darkest hour part, where if you are writing a 120-page screenplay, it's going to be right around here that they're hit hard by the villain and something dreadful happens and they're just in the pits. This is when they really had time to contemplate what they have attained from the goddess. And they said, I'm just going to have to accept it and move on. It's that area where they finally incorporate it, and now they're going to have a plan and push it. In the third act of the story, a part of them died, a part of them is transformed for the most part because they incorporate this truth within themselves. Now they're ready to go out into the world and make it so. This is part where Luke, after he obtains Leia, his mentor sacrificed himself so they could escape to save the universe. Now Luke, who had once thought he was just a farm boy with no place in the world, is starting to realize he does have a place in the greater scheme of things. And he has to continue on with Leia to go ahead and fight against the Death Star. It's not just enough to find Princess Leia and get her out of there. He has to be part of the Rebel Alliance now and fight against the great evil. Because he is one of the few Jedi. That's something the mentor has been telling him all this time. He's part of a greater destiny, of a greater path. He's going to have to take that torch from his mentor and help save the world from the great empire. And that's the third act, is where they are taking this truth within them to fight against them. So you didn't really see this shine for the most part until near the very end of the third act. And that's because they're going up against great opposition. They're dealing with the Death Star, they're dealing with cannons, they're dealing with a self-doubt which comes from Han Solo. And as they get closer to combating their nemesis, the nemesis is going to give one last bit of doubt. And this hero has to say, no, I got this light and I'm going to let it shine. And that is their truth. So we see Luke near the very end of the third act, showcasing that, no, I am a Jedi, I have a place in this world, and I'm able to help the rebels and the princess I just saved. Or I just rescued. And that's the moment where he took the scanner away. And that's when he uses that truth to help incorporate change in the world. I kind of do that, but I based it on my own doubt system, my own doubt points. As the story progresses, it follows a certain beat. Depending on the length of the book you're writing, a quarter in, they're entering a unfamiliar territory. Halfway through, you should have, at the midpoint, they attain a nugget of truth or something that they finally achieved. And at the last quarter of the book, they hit into the third act. Well, as I follow the beats, I realized there's another pattern that I could pick up on. At the 15%, 30%, 60%, and 90% of the story, the hero or heroine has to overcome a doubt. And a inner doubt they have to destroy, and that's part of their transformation as they obtain this truth. This is for a typical story that has a hero with a typical falsehood. As the story progresses, they drop that falsehood and pick up this truth. This is the typical arc, and I will create a video where we have a fallen hero and how I would incorporate that, but they dropped the truth and they obtained, a falsehood or a dark belief. But for now, let's say this is your typical hero story. So at the 15%, this is where it's after the inciting incident. If there are 2 points where you could have your inciting incident. In the prologue, at the very beginning of the story, or at the midpoint of your first act, which will be about your 12.5%. In novels, you have a lot more wiggle room than your scripts. You probably have like 15 pages, roughly, of wiggle room, whereas in a script you probably have about 5 pages. In a short story, it's going to be a lot tighter than that. It's going to be about like a page or like so many words. It really depends on the pacing of your story. Just after they have the inciting incident, they have their first doubt, and that is showcasing their false belief. And this is where Luke says, I can't go off and save the boat, I'm a farm boy, I gotta go and stay for harvest. So now they finally were kicked out the door, thanks to a wizard, and now they're in this unfamiliar territory. One of the things you can do is inserting pinch points. This came from the Dramatica story arc, where if you have a very long story or an epic, you tend to have pinch points where the villain can showcase their power. But technically, if we're dealing with percentages, we're like 50% of the story and 25% of the story. This is technically the second pinch at the 37.5%. Again, you have wiggle room. You don't have to have it necessarily there. This is what the normal populist flavor is. So for the second doubt, I suggest doing it at the 30 mark, which is just before the villain really showcased their hand. And this is where they doubt that they're able to get a hold of the situation. They're completely lost. They wandered around and lost their way, and they really don't know what to do. That is the doubt structure. This is where they start thinking about, why me? Why did I say yes? Why did I win over here? This is where they start doubting themselves again. But this time they're in an unfamiliar territory and they got lost. So what you do as a writer is, after you showcase this, you have their friends that they had accumulated at that time, or a guide. They come and swoop in and help them carry through this unfamiliar territory. This could be their mentor. This could be the unfamiliar territory guide, like Aragorn. Now, the midpoint is where we learned the truth of the matter, and they don't have any doubts. This is the moment where they achieve their greatest victory. In the Luke structure, this is him obtaining Leia. The villain tends to show their hand and show the most brutal action at the 62.5% of the story, or on that mark. And that's the second pinch point. You can have this third doubt before or afterwards, but it's kind of blended throughout here. I tend to showcase it as a moment where the character comes to a crossroads and he has to make a decision. Do I take this and start incorporating it within myself, or do I die with the denial that I have? But at that moment, this is when Luke kind of incorporates, okay, I'm not just a farm boy, I am a hero. I like to say that is just before the villain really punches them, because this is the moment where you start showcasing their transformation. The beginning part after they obtain the truth is where they're going through the obstacles laid down by the villain, and then here you show the transformation of the character. The last moment of doubt is when all the obstacles that they had encountered, having a plan, trying to incorporate that plan, and fighting against the great bad guy all the way down to the nemesis, which in Luke's case is Darth Vader, who had fought against his mentor and killed him. When Luke turned off the screen and started using his Jedi powers to blow up the Death Star, I like to say that's very close to the 90% mark of what I would say is the last self-doubt. Here, this is not much of a gut reaction. This is kind of the last bit of the falsehood that's just kind of clawing at the edge and trying not to let go. It's at the very edge of their mind. And all they have to do is just release it and just become the truth. So I want to say that's at the 90%. This is after all the obstacles that they have overcome, and they finally met their match, their nemesis. And they're able to overcome this nemesis because they incorporate this truth. And they're able to let it shine and transform the world. Now, that's kind of how I do it. I think about where the character is in the story. I tend to think that they start out with something that's not entirely true and unhealthy for them. And I think about where they are in the story pace. Now, I do this kind of when I write the first draft. When I do the second draft, that's when I really restructure the story to fit the pacing better. And a lot of chapters get moved around, things get dropped, things are added on, things are expanded. So that's the whole point of the second draft, is the restructuring of the story so that way it can be told in a clearer manner, where the general masses are able to handle it and digest it better. I tend to also incorporate my doubt system. I try to do this as I edit. I kind of do it as a checklist, like, okay, have they showcased these feelings, these issues that they're having at these moments? Of course, you can have it before or after the pinch points. You can have it blended throughout. But I kind of like to have it as a self-check to make sure that, oh, it is in there. It is in that section of the story. So if you're trying to do this as you're writing the first draft and it's not really coming out the way you want, just do the best you can. Just try to get the story down on paper and try to complete it. Try to throw as much problems as you can at them until they come to a crossroads, and start incorporating whatever truth that you put down earlier in the story. Don't worry about pacing all too much, because you have several drafts and several opportunities to refine it. in the first draft, just lay it down. And that's all I have for today. So if you like this type of video where I talk about stories and how I go about it, go ahead and click like. You're welcome to ask me any questions in the comments, and I will go ahead and answer them in the later videos. And as always, go ahead and subscribe and ring that bell. It will help you be notified when I put these videos up. I'm still trying to get into the swing of things, so I'm sorry this video came up a little late than I would like. But I try to do these videos once every 2 weeks. And of course, life happens. So just make sure you have that notification in the bar. And that way you know when I put something up. And I'll talk to you later. Bye!